Okay, I want you to just close your eyes for a second. We're going back in time. The date is July 9th, 1755.
Right.
We are standing deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, right near the Monongahela River, and it is just absolute chaos.
It's a slaughter. I mean, the air is thick with gun smoke, the smell of sulfur, you can hear the screams. It's a total ambush.
And you have these British regulars. These guys are supposed to be the best army in the world, and they're standing there in their bright red coats. They're basically giant targets.
And they're getting torn apart. They're marching in these perfect European columns, while the French and their Native American allies are completely invisible, hidden in the tree line, just picking them off one by one.
The whole command structure is gone. General Edward Braddock, the man in charge, has just been shot through the lung.
He's dying. So the troops, they start to panic. They're breaking rank. They're huddling together like sheep. It's a complete disintegration of a professional army.
But in the middle of this nightmare, this total collapse,
Yeah.
there's one guy who isn't panicking. He's this tall, lanky Virginian officer. He's only in his 20s. And he's riding back and forth between these shattering lines, literally trying to beat the men back into formation, trying to organize some kind of retreat so they don't all get wiped out.
And the descriptions from the people who survived are just chilling. This officer, he had 2 horses shot right out from under him, too.
Can you imagine?
He just scrambles up, grabs another horse, and keeps riding straight into the volley of fire. I mean, it's just unbelievable bravery.
So when the smoke finally clears and what's left of the British army just limps away, this officer takes off his coat, and he finds 4 bullet holes through the fabric.
4 inches from hitting him.
But not a single scratch on him.
Not a scratch. He actually wrote to his brother later that he believed he'd been saved by, and this is his quote, the miraculous care of Providence.
Wow.
That day, right there in the middle of a massive humiliation for the British Empire, the legend of George Washington was born. But here's the thing you have to remember.
What's that?
The man in that coat, riding through the smoke, he is not the stiff, white-haired old man you see on the dollar bill.
Right. He's not the marble statue yet. He's young. He's ambitious. He was probably desperate. And honestly, just incredibly lucky to be alive.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We've got a massive stack of sources here. We're talking diaries, military ledgers, letters to Congress, even his plantation records. We are going to try and strip away all the mythology.
We want to find the real person underneath.
Exactly. The surveyor who saw the world as a grid, the soldier who kind of accidentally started a world war, the president who didn't want the job, and the slaveholder who spent his entire life wrestling with this massive moral contradiction that he just couldn't solve.
It is a massive life. So I think we have to take this piece by piece. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. There's this common assumption, right, that Washington was born into the absolute top-tier elite, like he was British aristocracy just transplanted to Virginia. Is that accurate? Was he born with a silver spoon?
Well, yes and no. He was definitely born into the gentry, sure. That was in 1732 at Pope's Creek. But he wasn't top tier. I'd say he was more like a second-tier gentry. And the really defining moment of his childhood happens when he's just 11 years old.
His father dies.
His father, Augustine Washington, dies. And you have to understand, in that era, losing your father isn't just an emotional tragedy, it's an economic disaster.
It changes everything for him.
Completely. It changed his entire life's trajectory. I mean, if you look at the other founding fathers, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they all had these classic, very expensive educations. They all went to college. They're learning Latin and Greek and philosophy.
And Washington's older brothers had that right. They went to England.
They did. But when Augustine died, the money for George's education, it just vanished. There was nothing left for him.
So while Jefferson is off reading Plato in the original Greek, what's Washington doing?
He's learning practical math, geometry, trigonometry. He basically goes to trade school. And by the time he's 16, he's a professional surveyor. And I honestly cannot stress enough how important this is to understanding the man's mind.
Why? Is it just because he, knew the land really well?
It's deeper than that. It's about how he processed information. A surveyor looks at a chaotic forest, a total wilderness, and he imposes a grid on it. He measures it. He calculates it. It gave him, as one of the sources notes, a solid grounding in mathematics, but it also trained his eye.
How so?
When you spend years hacking your way through the frontier, you learn to read topography instantly. You look at a hill and you don't just see a hill, you see a defensive position, you see a line of sight, you see the logistical challenges of moving men and supplies over it.
That's a great point. So the other founders, the sort of philosopher founders, they saw the world as a set of ideas to be debated. Washington saw it as a map to be managed.
That is a perfect way to put it. His thinking was data-driven. And look, this was also his ticket to getting rich. He wasn't doing this for fun. He was speculating. He used his surveyor fees to buy up land. He was building a portfolio before he could even grow a decent beard.
But land wasn't enough for him. He wanted status. He wanted glory. And in 18th century Virginia, there was really only one place to get that.
The military.
Which brings us to the French and Indian War. And this is a part of the story that always just blows my mind, because we think of Washington as the guy who finishes wars. But in this case, he's literally the guy who starts one.
It's his crucible. The story starts around 1753, 1754. The British and the French are both eyeing the Ohio country. That's basically the area around modern-day Pittsburgh. It's the strategic key to the continent. So the British governor sends this 21-year-old major, George Washington, to deliver an ultimatum to the French.
And the message is simple. Get out.
Get out. And the French, I think is fair to say, basically laugh him out of the room.
So he comes back.
He comes back in 1754. This time with a small military force. He gets word that there's a French scouting party nearby, camped out in a little ravine called Jumonville Glen. Washington, along with a Native American leader, an Iroquois ally named Tenacarisin, or the Half King, they decide to surround them.
And we should be clear, this isn't really a battle. It's an ambush.
A surprise attack at dawn. It happens fast. Shots are fired, the French are wounded, and their commander, a man named Ensign Jumonville, is trying to explain that he's actually on a diplomatic mission. He's holding up his papers.
And what happens?
While he's talking, the Half King, who, by the way, had his own political reasons for hating the French and wanting to start a war, steps up and kills him.
So Washington, a British officer, is now technically responsible for the death of a French diplomat.
Yeah.
In peacetime.
The French certainly saw it that way. They called it an assassination. And because all the European powers were tangled up in these incredibly complex defense treaties, this little skirmish in the backwoods of Pennsylvania was the spark that lit the 7 Years' War. It became a global conflict. It was fought in Europe, in India, in the Caribbean, all over North America.
And Washington struck the match that set the world on fire.
He did, and his immediate reward for that is a place called Fort Necessity, which, just from the name, you can tell it wasn't great. And reading the sources, it sounds like the worst camping trip in history.
It was a disaster.
Yeah.
Washington falls back to this big open meadow, builds this flimsy little stockade Fort Necessity, and the main French force, led by Jumonville's brother, arrives. And they are angry and looking for revenge.
And then it starts to pour rain, just a torrential downpour. His trenches fill with water. His soldiers' gunpowder gets soaking wet and becomes useless. He's surrounded. He's outgunned. He has no choice.
He surrenders.
The only time in his entire life he ever surrendered his command to an enemy.
And to add insult to injury, the French commander hands him a document of surrender.
And it's written in French. Now, Washington can't read French very well. He has to rely on a translator who's, struggling in the dark and the rain. And Washington signs it.
And what if he just signed?
He unknowingly signed a confession. He admitted that he had assassinated Ensign Jumonville. The French used that document as propaganda all over Europe to prove that the British were the aggressors, that they were savages. Washington was utterly humiliated. He resigned his commission and went home.
But he doesn't stay home for long.
Yeah.
That brings us right back to our intro. General Braddock shows up with a massive British army, and Washington volunteers to be one of his aides. He's looking for redemption.
And he finds it at the Monongahela. We talked about the bullet holes in his coat, but what's really crucial here is what he learned from the British during this time. After Braddock's defeat, he spends years commanding the Virginia Regiment, defending the frontier. He's doing the hard work of a professional soldier, but the British military establishment, they treat him like a second-class citizen.
Right, because he didn't have a royal commission. He was a colonial.
Exactly. A captain in the British regular army officially outranked a colonel in the colonial militia. It didn't matter how much land you owned in Virginia or how well you fought. To them, he was just a provincial. And that resentment, it really burned in him. He realized that no matter what he did, the British system would never, ever see him as an equal.
And that's a powerful motivator for revolution, isn't it? It's not just about abstract philosophy. It's about personal disrespect.
It is. So the war ends, he retires again in 1758, and now we enter the next phase of his life where he becomes the planter. And the very first thing he does is secure his financial future.
By marrying up.
Way up. In January 1759, he marries Martha Dandridge Custis, and she was, without a doubt, the wealthiest widow in Virginia.
I just want to be clear about the scale here. We're not talking about a nice little dowry, are we?
No, this was empire-building money. She brought thousands and thousands of acres of land, substantial cash assets, and, crucially, hundreds of enslaved people.
And these were the dower slaves, right?
Yeah.
We need to flag that term.
Yes, because it becomes a legal and moral nightmare later on. These enslaved people belonged to the estate of her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. So Washington managed them, he profited from their labor, but he didn't technically own them. They were being held in trust for Martha's children.
But for all practical purposes, this marriage makes Washington one of the richest men in the colonies. He can now really focus on his passion project, Mount Vernon. And the sources here, they describe him as, well, he's almost like an agricultural scientist. He's not just sitting on the porch drinking mint juleps.
Oh, not at all. He ran Mount Vernon like a modern corporation. He was obsessed with efficiency and data. Remember, he's a surveyor at heart. He looked at his ledgers and he realized that tobacco, which was the main cash crop in Virginia, was actually a losing game.
Why is that?
It absolutely destroys the soil, and the market prices were completely controlled by merchants in London who were constantly, in his view, ripping him off.
So what does he do?
He pivots. He innovates. In 1766, he makes this huge decision to switch from tobacco to wheat. That is a massive risk. It required totally different equipment, different labor cycles. He actually invented a 16-sided treading barn. He designed a new type of building to separate grain from the stalk more efficiently. He was practicing crop rotation. He was testing different fertilizers.
But at the same time, he's trying to build this model American farm. The British government is making it harder and harder for him to succeed.
And this is really where the personal becomes political for him. We often think of the revolution as being all about high-minded philosophy, John Locke, natural rights. And for some of the founders, it was. But for Washington, it started with his wallet.
It was practical.
It was very practical. The British put restrictions on where he could sell his wheat.
Yeah.
They taxed the goods he had to import from England. They restricted settlement in the West, where he owned huge tracts of land. He felt the British boot on his neck every single time he opened his account books.
So by 1774, he's had enough. He's a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And he helps write something called the Fairfax Resolves. What's so significant about that document?
The Fairfax Resolves were a real turning point. He co-authored them with his neighbor, George Mason, and they were a bold, almost radical rejection of British authority. But they contain this massive, glaring contradiction.
I love that.
In the Resolves, they condemn the international slave trade as, quote, wicked, cruel, and unnatural.
Wait a minute. The man who at this point controls hundreds of enslaved people
Yeah.
is calling the slave trade wicked.
Yes. It just shows you that even as early as 1774, the cognitive dissonance was there. He knew it was wrong. He even said it was wrong, but he was completely economically dependent on it. And that's the paradox that he never, ever escaped in his lifetime.
But the slide toward war is unstoppable now. It's 1775. We have Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world.
The colonies are in open rebellion.
So the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia to figure out what to do next. And Washington shows up. And he's not wearing a civilian suit.
No. Everyone else is in their nice breeches and waistcoats, debating. Washington walks into the room wearing his old blue and buff military uniform from the French and Indian War.
That is such a power move.
Yeah.
It's totally silent, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't have to give a speech saying, pick me, pick me.
He didn't have to say a word. The uniform said it all. I am ready. I have the experience. I am the leader you're looking for. But, there was also a very shrewd political calculation being made by the Congress.
What was that?
Well, the war had started in Boston. It was being fought at that point, mostly by New Englanders. To win, they absolutely needed the southern colonies on board. Washington was a Virginian. By picking him, they united the colonies into a single cause.
So he gets the job. He rides north to Boston to take command. And what does he find when he gets there? Is there a gleaming, disciplined army waiting for him?
He finds a mob. It was, in his own words, a ragtag band of farmers and shopkeepers and laborers. They were filthy, they were completely undisciplined, they were drunk half the time, and they had zero respect for authority. They were loyal to their own little state militias, not to some abstract continental cause.
And Washington was horrified.
He was an aristocrat. He was appalled. He called them dirty and nasty people. He had to build an army from scratch, while the most powerful military on Earth, the British Army and Navy, the Death Star of the 18th century, was basically parked in the harbor.
Okay, so this is where we have to talk about how he actually fought the war. Because if you just look at the scorecard, the box score of battles, Washington actually lost more than he won. If he was a modern football coach, he probably would have been fired. So how did he win the war?
He won by realizing that the scorecard didn't matter. He wasn't trying to conquer territory. He was just trying to keep the revolution alive. His strategy was what historians call Fabian tactics. Alexander Hamilton, his brilliant young aide-de-camp, summed it up perfectly. He said the goal was to waste and defeat the enemy by piecemeal.
So in other words, don't die. Just keep the army in the field.
Exactly. As long as the Continental Army existed, even if it was just a few thousand freezing men, the British hadn't won. Washington understood that he didn't have to destroy the British Army, he just had to outlast the British public's political will to keep fighting. But that required immense discipline, because his own instinct was always to be aggressive. To fight, he had to constantly retreat.
Which brings us to the end of 1776. This has to be the lowest point of the war. He's been kicked out of New York. He's retreated all the way across New Jersey. His army is shrinking every day. The enlistments are all set to expire on January 1st. Everybody on both sides thinks the war is over.
It was the moment of maximum danger. I mean, the whole thing was about to collapse. If he didn't do something dramatic, the army would literally just dissolve and everybody would go home. So he gambles everything.
Christmas night, 1776. The crossing of the Delaware.
And we've all seen that famous painting, Washington standing heroically in the boat. But the reality was just grim.
Oh, he's breathing.
It was a sleet storm. The river was choked with huge chunks of ice. Many of the men were marching without boots, just wrapping their feet in rags. The sources say you could track the army by the bloody footprints they left in the snow.
But they made it across. They marched 9 miles to Trenton,
Right.
And they completely surprised the Hessian garrison station there.
And we should be clear, this wasn't a massive strategic victory in terms of territory, right? Trenton is a tiny little town.
Right.
But psychologically, it was everything. It proved to the American people that they could win. It absolutely shocked the British. And most importantly, it convinced the veteran soldiers to re-enlist. Washington basically saved the revolution in that one desperate frozen night.
Let's jump ahead now to another great test of his endurance and the army's. Valley Forge. The winter of 77-78. We all know about the cold, we know about the hunger, but the sources point out that this is where the army actually became an army.
Yes, that's a critical point. It wasn't just about suffering, it was a training camp. This is where a man named Baron von Steuben shows up. He's this flamboyant, larger-than-life Prussian officer who barely speaks a word of English, but he teaches the Americans the fundamentals of being a soldier.
Like what?
How to march in formation, how to reload their muskets quickly under fire, how to effectively use the bayonet. But the glue holding it all together through that horrific winter was Washington himself.
How so? What did he do?
He stayed. That's the key. He could have gone off to a warm, comfortable house nearby. He stayed in the camp with his men. He saw them eating what they called fire cakes, which was just flour and water baked on a rock. He was constantly begging a useless Congress for supplies. And on top of all that, he was dealing with threats to his own job.
The Conway Cabal.
The Conway Cabal. A group of his own officers and some politicians in Congress were whispering that Washington should be fired and replaced with Horatio Gates, the general who had won the Battle of Saratoga.
I mean, can you imagine firing Washington in the middle of the war? It seems insane.
It almost happened, but Washington navigated it with this really icy political brilliance. He exposed his critics, he rallied his supporters in the army, and he emerged even stronger. By the time that army marched out of Valley Forge in the spring, they weren't a mob anymore. They were a professional fighting force.
And that's the force that eventually traps the main British army at Yorktown in 1781. The British under Cornwallis surrender. The war is effectively won. But I want to focus on a moment after the fighting stopped. It's 1783, the Newburgh Conspiracy, because this feels like the moment where the American experiment almost died before it even started.
It is arguably the single most dangerous moment in the entire revolution. The army is camped at Newburgh, New York. They haven't been paid in months, maybe years. Congress is broke and just stalling. And the officers are furious. They feel betrayed.
So they start talking about a coup.
They do. They start circulating this anonymous letter suggesting that they should just march on Philadelphia and take their money from Congress at gunpoint. There's even talk of overthrowing the government and making Washington a king, or at least a military dictator, to restore order.
So Washington finds out, and he calls a meeting. He walks into this room full of angry, armed men who feel like their country has abandoned them.
You can just imagine the tension in that room. It must have been palpable. He gets up and he starts to read a letter from a congressman trying to explain the delay. But the text is small. He falters for a moment. He stops. And then he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out something nobody had ever seen him use in public before.
A pair of reading glasses.
Exactly. Only his closest aides even knew he used them. To the rest of the army, he was this invincible physical specimen, and he puts on the glasses and says, very quietly, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And the room just went silent. According to eyewitnesses, some of these battle-hardened officers just started to weep. In one single human sentence, he reminded them of the incredible sacrifice they had all shared together. He wasn't a king, he was their brother in arms. And just like that, the anger evaporated. The coup was over.
And he caps that off with the ultimate anti-dictator move. December 1783. He goes to Congress in Annapolis, and he officially surrenders his military commission.
There's a great story about that. The news got back to London, and King George III heard a rumor that Washington was just going to go back to his farm. And the king supposedly said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world.
Because nobody did that.
Nobody with an army at their back ever voluntarily gave up power. Caesar didn't. Cromwell didn't. In that one act, Washington established the bedrock principle of American democracy. The military is always subject to civilian control.
So he goes home. He wants to sit under his, as he called it, own vine and fig tree.
Sure.
But the country is a mess. The Articles of Confederation, which was the first attempt at a constitution, are failing spectacularly.
Oh, they were a total disaster. The central government had no power to tax. It couldn't raise an army. States were putting tariffs on each other's goods. It was descending into chaos. And then you get Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, angry farmers seizing courthouses. And Washington is watching all this from Mount Vernon, and he realizes, we fought a whole war for liberty, but we're about to lose it all to anarchy.
So he gets dragged, almost against his will, back to Philadelphia in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention.
He really didn't want to go. He had rheumatism. He was tired of public life. But he knew that if he didn't show up, the whole convention would lack legitimacy. So he goes, and they immediately elect him the presiding officer. He sits in the big chair at the front of the room. He rarely even spoke during the debates, but his presence hung over every single decision they made.
Especially when it came to designing the presidency.
Exactly. The delegates were terrified of creating a new king. That was their biggest fear. But they went ahead and created a powerful executive branch anyway. And why did they do that? Because they could look at the front of the room, see George Washington sitting there, and think to themselves, well, we can trust him with this power. The American presidency was literally designed with him in mind.
So, of course, he becomes the first president in 1789. And this is where the rubber really meets the road. He has to basically invent the job from scratch. Even the title, there was this huge debate in Congress. Some people wanted to call him His Highness the Protector of the United States.
Can you imagine? And Washington hated that. He just wanted to be called Mr. President.
Yeah.
Simple, Republican. But once the title was settled, he had to actually run the country. And probably his smartest move was how he constructed his cabinet. He basically built a team of rivals.
We have to talk about this dynamic. You've got Alexander Hamilton at the Treasury Department and Thomas Jefferson at the State Department. These two men hated each other. I mean, they had fundamentally different visions for what America should be.
They were polar opposites. Hamilton wanted a strong central government, a national bank, an economy based on manufacturing and credit. He wanted America to be more like Britain. Jefferson wanted a very weak central government, an economy based on small, independent farmers, and he loved everything about France and the French Revolution.
And Washington is stuck right in the middle of this.
As the referee. And frankly, if you look at the decisions he made, he sided with Hamilton's vision more often than not. He realized the new nation needed good credit. It needed to be powerful on the world stage. But having Jefferson there forced everyone to sharpen their arguments. The big problem, though, was that this feud gave birth to the one thing Washington hated more than anything else: political parties.
The Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson.
Right. Washington saw parties as factions that would do nothing but tear the country apart. He tried so hard to stay above it all, but the political attacks on him, especially in his second term, got incredibly vicious.
And he faced real violence, too. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794.
This was a huge test for the new government. Farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay Hamilton's new federal tax on distilled spirits. They beat up the tax collectors. They threatened to burn down Pittsburgh. This looked a lot like the Revolution starting all over again, and Washington had to decide. Is this new federal government real, or is it just a suggestion?
So what did he do?
He put his old uniform back on. He rode out at the head of 12,000 militia troops, an army that was actually larger than the one he'd led for most of the Revolution, by the way. He is the only sitting U.S. president to ever lead troops in the field.
And the rebels.
They saw this massive force approaching and just scattered. They went home. He proved, without firing a shot, that federal law was a law of the land.
Then you have foreign policy. The French Revolution goes completely off the rails, guillotines, the Reign of Terror. Then revolutionary France declares war on Britain. And Jefferson says, we have to help France. They helped us. And Hamilton says, no way, our trade with Britain is too important.
And in the middle of this, Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. He says the United States will stay out of it. And this was incredibly unpopular at the time. There were mobs in the streets of Philadelphia threatening to drag him out of his house. They burned him in effigy. But Washington knew that the U.S. was a baby nation. If it got sucked into a major European war, it would be crushed. He bought the country time to grow up. It was an act of supreme pragmatism over ideology.
And finally, his last great act as president. Leaving, just walking away.
He could have stayed. He could easily have been elected to a third term. He could have been president for life. But in 1796, he voluntarily steps down. He publishes his farewell address in the newspapers, where he warns the country against hyperpartisanship and getting entangled in foreign alliances. And for the second time in his life, he walks away from supreme power.
Okay, we have to pivot now. We cannot do a full deep dive on Washington without facing the darkest part of his legacy. We're calling this section The Shadow of Slavery.
It's the great tragic stain that you just can't wash away. You simply cannot understand Washington, his wealth, his lifestyle, his social standing, without understanding that it was all built on the forced labor of enslaved human beings.
Let's just look at the raw numbers.
He inherited 10 enslaved people when he was just 11 years old. By the time he died, there were 317 enslaved men, women, and children living and working at Mount Vernon.
Did he ever try to justify it, or did he, on some level, know it was wrong?
That's where it gets so complex. Before the Revolutionary War, he was a pretty typical Virginia planter. The records show he bought people, he sold people, he had people whipped for disobedience. But the war really did change him.
How so?
Well, he commanded black soldiers in the Continental Army. He saw their bravery. And he was exposed to these young, idealistic abolitionists in his inner circle, guys like John Laurens and the Marquis de Lafayette.
And Lafayette really pushed him on this, didn't he?
He did. Constantly. He would write to Washington and say, "How can you be the champion of liberty while you yourself own slaves?" And the sources show that privately, Washington started to agree. He wrote letters saying that slavery was inefficient and morally wrong. He said he wished to see it abolished by some sort of legislative act. He even stopped selling people because he said he didn't want to break up families.
But, and this is the massive but, he never once spoke out against it publicly.
Never, not once. He was convinced that if he, as president, took a public stand against slavery, the southern states, especially Georgia and South Carolina, would immediately leave the Union. He prioritized the unity of the nation over the abolition of slavery. He basically kicked the can down the road for future generations to deal with.
And his personal actions regarding his own property could be incredibly ruthless. We have to tell the story of Ona Judge.
This story just shatters the myth of the benevolent master. Ona Judge was Martha Washington's personal body servant. She was young, she was skilled, she lived with the president in the capital, Philadelphia. And in 1796, she found out that she was going to be given away as a wedding gift to Martha's granddaughter, a woman who was known to have a terrible temper.
And Ona Judge decided she was not going to let that happen.
She ran. She literally slipped out of the president's house while the Washingtons were eating dinner, found a sympathetic ship captain, and sailed to freedom in New Hampshire. Now, you have to remember, Washington was the most famous man on earth. He was incredibly wealthy. He didn't need her labor. He could have just let her go.
But he didn't.
He didn't. He was furious. He saw it as a personal betrayal and as a theft of his property.
What did he do?
He used the full power of the federal government to get her back. He had his Secretary of the Treasury write to the customs collector in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, ordering him to hunt her down and apprehend her.
And the collector found her.
He did. And Ona Judge was incredibly brave. She stood her ground. She told the official she would only return if the Washingtons promised to free her after they died.
And what was Washington's response to that offer?
He refused to negotiate. He wrote that agreeing to her terms would reward unfaithfulness and would set a bad example for the other slaves. He even considered hiring thugs to basically kidnap her and bring her back to Virginia by force. But the local collector warned him it would probably cause a riot in New Hampshire, so he eventually backed down. Ona Judge lived the rest of her life as a fugitive, but she died a free woman.
That is a very hard story to reconcile with the man who wrote so eloquently about liberty. But then, at the very end of his life, we have his will. And this is another sharp pivot in the story.
It really is. In the summer of 1799, just a few months before he died, Washington sits down and writes his last will and testament. And he does something that no other major slaveholding founding father did. Not Jefferson, not Madison, none of them. Washington ordered that all the slaves he owned in his own right were to be freed.
Were they freed immediately upon his death?
No, they were to be freed upon the death of his wife, Martha. He also provided money from his estate to care for the elderly who could no longer work, and to educate the young children so they could learn a trade and support themselves. It feels like a final act of atonement, like he was trying to clean his slate with history.
But there was a tragic catch, wasn't there? It involved those dour slaves we mentioned at the beginning.
Yes, this is the heartbreaking part. Washington only had the legal authority to free the people he personally owned. That was about 123 people. The other 150-plus people at Mount Vernon belonged to the Custis estate. He had no legal right to free them. They had to be passed on to Martha's grandchildren.
So you had situations where a husband was owned by George, and his wife and children were owned by the estate.
Exactly. When Washington's slaves were finally freed, families were ripped apart forever. It was just a heartbreaking, tragic mess. And there's a grim little footnote to this story. Martha actually freed Washington's slaves early, in 1801, a year before she died.
Why did she do that?
It seems it was out of fear. Abigail Adams visited Mount Vernon around that time and wrote that Martha was terrified. She realized she was living in a house surrounded by more than 100 people who knew that the only thing standing between them and freedom was her heartbeat. That's a very dangerous incentive. So she let them go.
Let's move to the end. It's December 1799. He's 67 years old. He's finally truly retired.
He's out doing what he loved best, riding his horse for hours around his farms. It's a terrible day. It's snowing, hailing, raining. He comes back soaking wet. But he's a stickler for punctuality, so he doesn't change out of his wet clothes before dinner. He wakes up in the middle of the night and he's clutching his throat.
It was a severe throat infection, right?
Most likely acute epiglottitis. His throat was swelling shut. He couldn't breathe. And the doctors... Well, 18th century medicine was brutal. They bled him repeatedly. They ended up taking something like 80 ounces of blood. That's almost half the blood in a human body. They were basically torturing him in a desperate attempt to save him.
And on the evening of December 14th, he realizes it's the end.
He checks his own pulse one last time. He says to his doctors, "'Tis well," and he dies.
So we've gone from the ambitious young surveyor to the revolutionary general to the president to, in his final act, an emancipator. When we look at this entire massive arc of his life, what is the final takeaway? He wasn't the smartest of the founders. He wasn't the best writer or speaker.
No. Hamilton was a financial genius. Jefferson was a philosophical visionary. Washington was solid. His superpower wasn't his intellect. It was his judgment and his character. He was the only man who could hold that starving army together at Valley Forge. He was the only man who could hold the government together when Hamilton and Jefferson were tearing at each other's throats.
So he was the indispensable man because he was the center of gravity.
He was, and because he understood the most important and rarest thing about power. You have to be able to let it go. In a world that was full of kings who clung to power until their dying breath, Washington walked away. Twice. He taught the new nation that the office is always bigger than the man. And I think that is why, despite his profound flaws, despite the darkness of slavery, he remains the essential foundational figure of the American founding.
A deeply complicated man, but a monumental and indispensable life.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life of George Washington. If you enjoyed this journey through the contradictions and triumphs of the indispensable man, do us a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button for the History Titans channel. Like this audio and maybe share it with a friend who needs a good history fix. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the people who shaped our world. Thanks for listening.